So I'm just thinking what it would be to gain kind of universal insight or something like that, or the idea that that might be an aspiration, to be able to see not from a single viewpoint but from every possible vantage point simultaneously, and also kind of correlates of that in terms of time and in terms of language. I mean, in terms of the viewpoint thing, because it's a fascinating word, viewpoint, isn't it? And there's a thing called a viewpoint theory, which is about knowledge, and how a lot of knowledge is kind of perspectival, you know, how you look at things colours what you see. Of course, that's pretty obvious, isn't it, really? But that kind of visual metaphor of taking a visual viewpoint and not necessarily leading to a limited insight in what you can perceive, that taken as a metaphor for other kinds of knowing, that we always know things from where we are, and bring our biases to that, or just our limitations, really, I suppose, not even necessarily biases. But with that, there's also the idea, or accompanying that recognition of our own individual limitations in terms of knowledge via this sight metaphor. There's this, as I say, this ambition to gain a better insight, or to gain an overview. That's another word we use, isn't it? Overview. Almost as if instead of here we all are standing on this plane looking at these different objects, as if we can somehow be over the top, looking down, an overview, which takes in the whole big picture, you know. That's the God's eye view, isn't it? And it's attributed to God, in fact. That's his special power, isn't it, to have insight, which is difficult to conceptualize. I mean, I think there's a passage in the Bible where Jesus says something like, "When your eye be single, then you will know everything," or something like that. Anyway, I don't know what a biblical scholar would make of that, but I understand that passage as being having that kind of a referent, you know, rather than having individual viewpoints here on the ground. There's an ideal way to pool all possible viewpoints from a single vantage point outside of the system, but which has ultimate access. That's a kind of God's eye view, isn't it? Not even over in that case, it's just everywhere, the view from everywhere. And yeah, I guess I'm kind of visualising that to the extent that I can imagine such a thing at all, as being a bit like depth perception. You know, like I've got depth perception, my eyes are 3 inches apart, and my brain has got some software to do some processing on the slightly different images that parallax view gives me, and translates the differences between what I can see in one eye and what I can see from the other eye, translates that difference into this thing I call depth perception. I don't see two images, even though that's what my brain is perceiving. I see depth. So I'm kind of imagining this overview, this single eye of God, or however you want to phrase that. Objectivity, I don't want to use that word, but that kind of idea. Omniperception. I'm imagining that as a kind of like depth perception. You know, like if your eyes and my eyes were joined to the same system, so that in the same way that my two separate eyes are joined to the same system. So if your eyes and my eyes were joined together in a way that rendered them as singular, not as two images, not as two viewpoints, but as something akin to depth perception. You know, I'll get a deeper understanding by having direct access to these viewpoints and merge them in certain ways. That's kind of imagining that. And if it's not just you and I, of course, it's everything, everybody. So I've got Phoebe's as well. Phoebe's eyes would be in parallax to my own, with that kind of canine, sapien merging, the kind of depth perception that would emerge out of that. So that's what I'm thinking of. Again, it's, you know, it's aspirational, and we all fall short of that necessarily, and inevitably we'll always fall short of that. And there's no one has that view, and it's not a possible view. It's just an idea, isn't it? But it's a really powerful idea, I think. And it kind of relates for me to two other views as well. One that's often associated with God. I was reading a passage, well, it was a quotation from St. Augustine this morning in a book I was reading by Mark Turner, and it's a passage in Augustine where he's talking about time and how we live as humans, we live moment to moment, day to day, but God in Augustine's philosophy doesn't do that. It's and it's not even outside of time in that. That's how it might be phrased, but it's all of time is simultaneous. So that those multiple viewpoints that we get on the passage of time by having this clock that kind of runs. So I combine the viewpoint of yesterday and the viewpoint of today and call that the passage of 24 hours, almost like a temporal version of depth perception, to an almighty and divine super being who had all of time in a moment, who that time was singular. Then it wouldn't be like that, would it? It would be like I guess it would be like the block universe, actually, thinking about it. Some version of the block universe. Anyway, so that would be time. And then the third thing, which I think is related, is to do with language. Because I think many of us aspire to the idea of a perfect language. A language which perfectly reproduces both our thoughts when we try to express something and map perfectly onto its experience, and also maps and describes perfectly those aspects of the world we want to talk about that can't be directly experienced. We'd like that kind of angelic language almost, I think, where there is no slippage, there's no ambiguities, there's no mistakes. Everything can be talked about perfectly. But that's not, again, that's a failing dream. Even the languages of something like mathematics and logic, which I guess are the closest you're ever going to get. When Russell and people like Gödel were working on those, it's demonstrated that even those fall short. They can't perfectly capture the world, and there's always going to be ambiguities and things left out of those languages. But it doesn't say we can't have that as an idea, And that idea of a perfect language, you do find that, as I say, in mythology and religion and just in our own intuitions and desires. I think sometimes, in many ways, the fall is a bit like that, isn't it? The biblical story of the fall, and particularly the Tower of Babel. That prior to the Tower of Babel, we assume there was a singular language, and I hear in that some aspiration toward a perfect language. And now, of course, our languages are dispersed, but they're not just dispersed; they're viewpointed, aren't they? They're scattered. That's the myth that runs through that, I think. You also find that idea of the perfect language in, I guess, in things like the angelic languages of some of the alchemists. I think John Dee had this idea of the angelic, maybe in the language that Joseph Smith is supposed to have found the golden plates. They were supposed to be written in angelic language, weren't they? Dictated by the angel Moroni or something like that. Bonnie Moroni. So I think you find it there too, and maybe even in that kind of, whatever it's called, that kind of panglossia you get from people who speak in tongues. I don't know if this is absolutely the case, but I think there's a suggestion that the language they're speaking in is some kind of language which is prelapsarian. It's that kind of perfect language that exists before the fall, before our words were scattered, before our eyes were put all over the place, before we were laid out in time, before we had to rely on the pooling of your words and mine and the resolving of ambiguities as best as we can to try and sort all that mess out. Yeah. So yeah, that's that really. That's all I've got to say on this fine morning in Cornwall. It's a nice myth, that myth of a one language, the myth of a one perfect viewpoint, the myth of one time. Yeah.